Terra Arcanum is a world filled with wonder. From the four planes to the mysterious abyss, nearly everything has a story to tell. But to learn more about this fantastic world, we need to dive deeper than the books and the tabletop RPG. Join me as we reveal the secrets of Terra Arcanum. With the core races having established kingdoms and borders across the known world, they settled into their respective lands and cast weary eyes at their neighbor. The dwarves, preferring rugged and mountainous terrain, used the immense amount of stone, copper, and later bronze, along with the enslaved orcs, to construct some of the most remarkable structures and features ever to be seen, rivaled only by the Titans. The elves preferred the forest and jungles where they first appeared, using the magic taught to them by the dragons to shape the natural world into their cities and homes. The Jangu, ever the isolationists, remained in their deep underwater empires, their cities of coral and rock remaining a mystery to the rest of the world. Lastly, the humans tended to settle on the plains and coasts, a decision that would eventually lead to them becoming some of the most successful traders as the years went on. In time, petty squabbles and disputes would arise, such as the Jangu declaring all the seas belonging to them. They required kingdoms to get permissions, and the ships sailing their waters would need to pay a toll. This would lead to many of the dwarf and human kingdoms placing their own restrictions on Jangu trade. This would eventually result in the Land-Sea War, an ultimately feudal war that lasted only a couple months and only several hundred casualties. But the peace that followed would only drive a deeper wedge between the Jangu and the surface races. However, the lack of military presence in the dwarven cities during this time is what led to the Orc Uprising. The Orcish revolt forced the dwarves to pull out of their war early in order to maintain stability at home. In the end, the Orcs would earn their freedom but have nowhere to go. Several of the human kingdoms accepted the Orcs into their societies. This would lead to an explosion in the goblin population. While these hybrids were shunned and hated by the majority of the humans, the orcs embraced goblins as a sign of their growing partnership with the humans. However, the political consequences of this alliance would lead to the bloodiest wars in Terra's history. It started simply. The dwarves, still angry at losing their slaves, closed trade with any human nation that harbored their former workforce. The elvish countries, also supporting the dwarves, threatened to end relations with any nation that would ally themselves with former slaves. The loss of these trade partners would lead to the eventual collapse of many kingdoms. As a result, the orcs were ejected from human lands. Again, with nowhere to go, and fear of re-enslavement, the orcs fled to the deserts, left mostly uninhabited by the other races. They became nomadic, living off the land and avoiding, or even sometimes raiding, the few settlements that were scattered throughout. During this time, the goblin hybrids were faced with an oppressive treatment. They were left with scraps and were paid little to nothing for their services. Many starved, while others went in search of the rumored hybrid kingdoms hidden across the world. One day, an orc named Cormac would seize control of his clan and rally the remaining tribes into a cohesive force. He claimed the other races were to blame for their lifestyle, and together they could take what was rightfully theirs. He marched his army across the desert, demanding that the humans and dwarves recognize the orcs as a sovereign people and grant them the same respect as any other nation. When the dwarves refused, Cormac ordered the attack on the dwarven nations. This conquest would eventually lead his armies to the doorstep of the Titan city Adido. An ambitious commander within Cormac's army would lead an attack against the city despite Cormac's orders. This surprise attack would lead to the fall of the Titans' last bastion and the functional extinction of their race. Even with the substantial loss to his army, Cormac continued on, successfully forcing the surrender of two other dwarven kings. But his war was not done. He may have claimed the land for his people, but the remaining dwarf and human nations had yet to meet his demands. So he marched on, winning battle after battle and pushing his enemies back. Several of the human rulers requested aid from the elves, but nothing would come of these pleas. The elves believed that by not participating, they would spare their nation of Cormac's wrath. With Cormac closing in, one king, Edric, reached out to the only race left he believed would help, the dragons. But the dragons refused his request. Their power could easily end the war, but they believed they should limit their interference in the affairs of others to teaching. Desperate and afraid, King Edric ordered his council to delve into the deepest secrets of magic. This research would lead to the binding of many dragons to Edric's will, and he would use these dragons to utterly destroy Cormac, leading to his inevitable surrender. Drunk on this new power, Edric claimed the lands conquered by Cormac for himself, and then turned his attention to the wayward elves who had refused his call to aid. He would send his dragons to annihilate them in what would become known as Edric's Purge. During this dark time, the elves fought back as best they could, but the combined armies of human and dragon proved too great. The elves lost battle after battle, and their cities and people were nothing but ash in the wake of Edric's rampage. The dwarves, fearing what might become of them after Edric was through with the elves, united under a single banner and retreated to Garnenheim deep within Terra, sealing the great mithril gates behind them. But all was not lost. One of Edric's greatest generals, Bartellum, found a way around Edric's binding spell. By forging a dark pact with the dragon Chaldea, Bartellum was able to free her from Edric's control. In exchange for her freedom, Chaldea granted Bartellum a portion of her strength and power. The two became the first Dragon Knight, and together they set out to free as many dragons as possible and end the war. With many of Edric's dragons freed from his control, and the remnant forces of elves, dwarves, and humans, Bartellum and Chaldea led the final assault on Edric's castle, slaying the Butcher King and breaking the binding on the dragons. After Edric's defeat, Bartellum and Chaldea founded the Order of the Dragon Knights, a guild dedicated to ensuring that no war would ever again ravage the world and ensure the protection of all races. And so an uneasy peace fell over Terra, the many nations and countries tolerating each other and building grudges that they dare not act upon for fear of the Dragon Knight's wrath. But tensions can only be stretched so far. Eventually, they must break.